We're going to pick up from where we left off last week as the text itself does. We're going to be in the book of Judges. If you want to turn there, we're going to spend some time here on the front end to think through just kind of how we got to where we are, just thinking through the Pentateuch as a whole, the book of Joshua last week, some of the themes that we need to have in mind as we come to the book of Judges, as we're thinking through the storyline of Scripture. But just as you look at chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Judges, it picks up right where Joshua left off. Chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" So they are in this period of conquest, and we know even from the end of the book of Joshua that they aren't faithful in completing that conquest, right? They give in at different stages and with different peoples, and we're reminded of that here at the beginning of Judges as well. We're going to see in chapter 2, or at the end of chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, kind of this intro to the rest of the book. The author of Judges spells it out very clearly for us. These are the places that these tribes failed to drive out. They failed to conquer in the promised land. I mean, beginning in verse 27 of chapter 1, that's done very clearly. You see there, it says, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of this place and its villages, and it goes down through the different tribes there. And we know that that's very significant. We're going to talk about that. What does that mean in terms of their faithfulness to the covenant, their faithfulness to God, and how is God going to continue to be faithful to them through that, but what the consequences will be as he spelled out. So let's take some time here at the beginning, just to kind of set the stage for where we are. So if you had to think back through your time studying in the Pentateuch, so Genesis through Deuteronomy, just briefly, if we were to kind of highlight where we've been, some of the major themes and principles that we've picked up along the way as we connect this storyline together, let's just start in Genesis, and then we'll speed it up going through the rest of the Pentateuch. But what are the things that we need to remember and to know, big picture, from the book of Genesis as we come to the book of Judges? How does it all piece together? Just yell out a few of those. Okay, creation. All right, so we got 1 and 2 there, and fall. And let's just say, baked into these, there's other things with it, right? So in creation, what's the main thing that's being communicated there is, who is this God, right? Who is this covenant God of Israel? Well, he's not like the other gods. He is the God who created everything, created the heavens and earth. He's the Lord over it. He's not just Lord and King over a people, but he's Lord and King over all the earth, right? He's unique, okay? And even within fall, right, we get this description, understanding of here in creation also who we are as humanity, but then the impact of sin, and that plays itself out very clearly in the book of Judges, as we'll perhaps better than lots of other places we'll see. Anything else from Genesis? Covenant, okay. What covenants? Sure. Sure. Okay. So covenants, let's just say particularly, as we highlighted previously and even last week, particularly this covenant with Abraham. What is the covenant with Abraham that God makes with him that's particularly relevant as we come to the book of Judges? Okay. So people, they're going to be a great people. They're going to have a great land. And what are they to do with that people and land? Okay, they're going to be a blessing to the nations. And in our terms, I think last week and previously we looked at this notion of rest, right? They're going to rest in the land. It's going to be a new Eden in a sense, where they will commune with God. And from that land, this people in relationship with God are going to be as Isaiah says later, they're going to be a light to the nations, right? So that the nations would see, this is who the God of Israel is, and I should want to be a part of that because they're flourishing in the land. Okay, that's great. Let's speed up a little bit. I don't want to take all of our time here, but so just thinking through let's just go through the rest of the Pentateuch. So Exodus through Deuteronomy. What do we need to remember? Big picture, top of mind as we come into the book of Judges. Kind of what takes place. Okay, so we see. No, that's good. No, that's good. No, that's great. So holiness. This is good. Yeah, God's holy. And what does that mean for the people of Israel? God is holy. They are to be holy. I am the Lord your God. You shall be. I am holy. Therefore, you shall be holy. Okay. Good. What else? Other big picture things we need to remember.
He sees them and he rescues them.
Okay. So yeah. So that's just the exit. No. So we can just say delivery, freedom, but even yeah. We'll just say he's faithful to his promises. And you're right, that is identity. God chooses to reveal himself in that way, and that's the means by which the people are primarily to relate to this God. And over again, all throughout these books, just everywhere, it's repeated. What does God say? He says, I am who? I'm the God who brought you out of slavery from Egypt so that you could be my people and I could be your God. Okay, anything else? Mm-hmm. All right. That's good. So we'll say, let's just say Mosaic covenant. It's, God gives the law by which they're to relate to God. So moral, it's a revelation of God's moral character. And also distinctives. So this is, think especially the Levitical, go in Leviticus and elsewhere, all of these laws and prescriptions, hundreds of them, and some of them we read them and we're like, I don't understand why this is important, right? And that's not discounting it. It's just like why did God ask them to do this? To only wear clothing that was made out of one material, or to only plant one seed in their fields. Well, just at base we could say he was calling them to be distinct from the other peoples around them, therefore revealing his character and his relationship with them. Okay, what else?
Well, you see a constant where God is always keeping his promises to the people.
Yep.
In spite of their massive disobedience.
Yeah, so God is always faithful to the covenant, and the people are pretty much always, more or less, unfaithful to the covenant. Goodness gracious. Sure. Okay, good. So flood, we see here, this is God's judgment. I guess flood is after the fall. Y'all know that. We'll just put that right there. And Joseph. So these key figures that help us to see how God is going to care for his people and also to explain what's coming next, right? Okay. And that's a good thing here. Again, key leaders, especially Joshua, leading into Joshua that we looked at last week. Okay. Let's just briefly go to Joshua. What are some key principles from last week that we have, or key events, principles, things that we have to keep in mind coming into the book of Judges? Okay, so taking the land, and it's not just any land. It's not just random land. It's this land, right? It's the land that he promised Abraham. Okay, what else?
Really, God's giving them that, right?
Sure. Yeah. Receiving the land, right? God says, I will fight for you. I'm taking this land from these peoples as an act of judgment and as an act of faithfulness to my promises. I'm giving this land to you, right? They go and they run around Jericho They don't siege the walls. They run around it for a week, and God fights for them, and then they take the land. Okay, what else? Anything else from Joshua? Okay. Sure. Let's just say we're seeing this notion of anointed leaders, these deliverers that are they're leading the people to faithfulness to God, to obedience to the covenant, and they are God's means by which He delivers the people, even though they themselves are fallen. You go back to Moses. Moses even says, "Hey, God's going to raise up a prophet greater than me." And what is that? Numbers 28. I think we'll just say Numbers. He said there's a prophet coming after me. Okay, what else? Anything else from Joshua? Yeah, that's good. So just over and over again, even though there's little glimmers of hope, it's like, no, these people still don't get it, right? God is still faithful to His promises, faithful to bless, and faithful to judge the nations and Israel, and yet they remain unfaithful to the covenant. Okay, that's all good. All important things. I think it's helpful for us. We're coming into a book like this, especially where we're just going to be overviewing, right? Big pictures. It's important for us to remind ourselves of those as we come in. So let's look at the book of Judges. Like you said, it follows chronologically. The end of the book of Joshua, right? The people have come into the land. The land has been conquered for the most part, and the inheritance has been distributed among the peoples. And Joshua, even though his death is pointed to here in the book of Judges, we're reminded of that at the end of Joshua as well, where Joshua has this Mosaic-like moment where he commends the people to be faithful to God in the land, to not turn to the gods of the nations around them or the gods that they even brought with them out of Egypt, but to commit themselves to follow God as they live in the land. And so the question in Judges is, are the people going to be able to be this light to the nations in the land? Even though we've seen that they weren't faithful to take all of it, even in this fragmented sense, are they going to be able to keep the land? Are they going to be able to be this light covenant people to the nations within Canaan? And as we know and we'll see, hopefully in more fullness, Judges portrays just the utter chaos of what it looks like when God's people reject Him and reject His promises, reject the responsibilities that He gave to them. But ultimately, it's a rejection of Him, a rejection of God as their ruler and king and Lord over them. And they descend into this pattern that we're going to see of idolatry. And that's the primary issue here, is they fall into idolatry and they become like the gods that they choose to worship. And many scholars, others will say that the book of Judges is this process of the people of Israel becoming like the nations, being Canaanized, becoming like the nations that they did not drive out from the land. Just briefly, just in terms of details, in terms of authorship, dating, the author of Judges is unknown. There's no author that identifies himself, but we know that its time span covers roughly around 300 to 400 years, give or take, from their establishment into the land, and then to some time right before the age of the monarchy. If we look at just kind of summary statements for the whole book, which we're going to look at these more specifically later. But in the last section of the book, Judges 17 through 21, there's a statement that's repeated 4 times, over and over and over again, that really kind of summarizes the book and gives us a picture of what's happening. Anybody know what that is? There was no king in Israel. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's repeated 4 times, but it's most climactically, it's the statement that closes the book. So Judges 21, verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's a statement of fact, and it's also a diagnostic statement, right? It's describing what's taking place in the people's hearts. So as we look at major themes of Joshua, again, very very similar to what we walked through last week in terms of Joshua and previous books, which there's purpose in that, right? These same three themes that we're going to continue to evaluate: land, rest, trust. These are all implications of God's covenant to Abraham, right? So that's why we continue to see these themes played out. So what will these themes, how do they work in the book of Judges? Well, like we said, in terms of land, the question is, will the people keep it? Will they be able to maintain even their fragmented hold in the promised land that God has given them? This theme of rest. Are the people going to be able to rest in the land? Right. The book begins with some sense of rest. The people are enjoying some semblance of rest, even though there are enemies remain, and yet this rest does not last. Right. There are still peoples in the land that they must fight against. So. Well, I'll leave that as it is. Will they be able to rest? And then lastly, trust. Are the people going to trust God to fight for them, to maintain their hold in the land, to walk before Him in accordance with His covenants? Will they trust Him? And it becomes increasingly clear that no, they're not going to trust God. And they're also not going to trust in full the leaders that God sends to them to help them walk in faithfulness and to rescue them from their enemies. So if we had to say kind of a summary sentence, and it sounds very similar to what we saw in Joshua, but fleshing it out a little bit more, summary sentence of the book of Judges, we see that Israel requires a perfect Savior to maintain the land of rest and to flourish in it. And this is, we're picking up, right? I mean, Moses, Joshua, we've had these leaders and figures that to some degree have led the people into faithfulness. But in Judges particularly, we get a new picture of leaders that are sent by God and yet are just horrendous, right, in many ways, and in an increasing sense, right? And they're deliverers. God sends them out of grace, these judges that we'll see, and yet we find that they are progressively more and more like the peoples of Canaan, that they are just sinful themselves and lead the people, even in some sense, do not keep the people from devolving into further idolatry and destruction. Any thoughts there, just from context as we open up the book? Before we walk through some of the major sections? Anything? No? Chill? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. For sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's definitely true. The book has a cyclical nature. You'll hear people talk about it as a downward spiral, which we'll look at. You know, the people are living before God, and then they engage in idolatry, and as a result of that idolatry, God judges them by giving them over to a people. But then they, in their destitution, they cry out to God, and He sends a deliverer, a judge, and He leads them into a time of revival, flourishing, obedience to God, and then it just happens again, right? And then they have this period of idolatry, and that cycle repeats itself. I think that's helpful. I also think it's helpful just to kind of do it as like a stair step, right? It's this period of flourishing, and then decline, and then there's a judge, and He brings revival and restoration, but then that next decline is much steeper, right? It's a progressively downward slope that we see in this cycle. So yeah, that's good. We're going to see that. Anything else? Say it again.
They wanted their cake and to eat it too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All this stuff for us, and we still want to do what we
Mm-hmm. Yeah, God, give us the blessings of the covenant, but don't require us to live like you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they want to be like the nations, and yet want to have the benefits of being God's people and still be like the nations. And we see that going into the monarchy, right? That's what they say. They say, God, give us a king like the nations. And they get what they ask for, and that does not go well. Tim Keller, I think he describes the book in a very beautiful way. He describes Judges like this. He says that in the book of Judges, God relentlessly offers his grace to people who do not deserve it, to people who do not seek it, and who never appreciate it even after they've been saved by it. I was like, man, that's good. And that's one of the things that we must draw out of the book of Judges, right, is how we respond to God's grace to us. So in Judges, here in this first few, really we're going to break the book down into just kind of three big sections. And in them we're going to see God's continued grace to the people and the people's radical sin problem that is not dealt with in fullness. And in seeing this, God's deliverance, the people's response, I think the main kind of response that the book of Judges should create in us as we read it and spend time in it over and over again throughout our lives is this sense of, it should build in us this greater sense of longing that the people had and should have had even more so, a longing for a greater, more complete, more full deliverer, right? A longing for a true and better judge that would release them from this cycle of sin and idolatry and mess. And that sense of longing, Judges should produce that in us as we look to Jesus and find all of our fullness in him. So, three big sections we're going to look at here in the book. Let's dive into the first one. So first we see Israel's failure that's given to us in Judges chapter 1, chapter 2, and the first part of chapter 3. So looking at the beginning again of Joshua 1, as we already said, doesn't start out pretty. We're just reminded, just for fun, that Joshua's dead. The inheritor of Moses' mantle is dead in the land. And then we also see, as we already said at the end of chapter 1, not only is Joshua dead, but the people failed to a great extent to drive out the peoples in the promised land as they had been instructed by God. They were unfaithful in their holy war that God had given them, not as ethnic cleansing or anything of the sort, but as a means of God's justice against the nation's unrighteousness and also as a gift to his people. And then in chapter 2 and in the first part of chapter 3, what the author of Judges does for us after the death of Joshua is to give us a description of what's going on in the people's hearts and what plays out in the rest of the book. It describes Israel's unfaithfulness to God after the book of Joshua. After the life of Joshua. So look in chapter 2, beginning in verse 6. So we're reminded here again, right? It's just repeated over and over for us that indeed Joshua is dead. He's still dead. And this is the state of the people that's described after that. So chapter 2, verse 9. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Does that sound familiar? I think that's something that's repeated multiple times in this storyline of Israel, that they experience God's great flourishing, and then there arises a new generation who does not know, does not live in light of that. What do you think that can serve as an indictment against? I think that verse should really stop a lot of us in our tracks. What do you think the author of Judges is kind of condemning here in 2:10, or seeking to convict us of? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this really should serve as as a challenge to us. I mean, in parenting, but even not as parents, just as a challenge of discipleship, right? And we ask that. I mean, how in the world could these people not have passed on this knowledge of the Lord and the work that He had done to their children, to their community, right, to their tribes? And yet that's what we see, right? He says, there arose another generation who did not know the Lord or the work that He had done for Israel. They were not aware, or at least they did not understand the implications of God's saving activity on their behalf in the covenant for their own lives. So that's what we see. We see a new generation in the land, and they are going to be unfaithful to the covenant. So verse 11, and in response to that knowledge, chapter 2, verse 11, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals. So they have forgotten God. They've forgotten this covenant-keeping God who brought them out of Egypt, and they have turned to other gods, right? There's not going to be a worship vacuum in their hearts. They fill it with these foreign, pagan idols that they have around them. In verse 12 it says, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they turned to serve these foreign gods. And so, verse 14, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and He gave them over to plunderers. That familiar language, right? He gave them over to what they desired, to plunderers who plundered them. He sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. So what's God doing here? In response to their idolatry and unfaithfulness, what is God doing in His response? Okay, what part of the covenant? Yeah, right. I mean, God is not acting arbitrarily. Again, over and over again, we have to go back, and the prophets do the same to Deuteronomy 28, right? God had given them. These are the blessings. These are the curses for the covenant, and these are exactly the things that God had said would happen if they forsake Him, if they turn to other gods. And so God is bringing that to pass. And then verse 16, here is where we get this cycle of the judges played out. But before we walk into that, I do want to go back to the beginning of chapter 1 and just get this picture of, even in the midst of God's punishment, even in the midst of God handing the people over to the results of their sin, here we get a reminder even of God's covenant faithfulness. So back up to the beginning of chapter 2. And this is what God says. He says in verse 1, He said, I brought you up from Egypt. I brought you into the land that I swore to give your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. So even here, God is telling the people, I am not going to break covenant with you. You are unfaithful, you're forsaking the covenant, but I'm going to act consistently with what I've told you, and yet you are going to get what you've asked for, what your deeds lead to, and that is the thorn. The nations will be a thorn in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you. And that's what we see from here on out, right? That's not just the book of Judges. That's the rest of the Old Testament, in a sense, leading up to kind of the culmination of this covenant response from God, which is ultimately the exile. But let's go back. So Judges chapter 2, verse 16. This is where God describes for us this cycle that repeats, and we're not going to get into the specifics of many of the individual judges, but I want us to get this clearly, this description of what takes place with all of the judges that are recorded for us in the book. So 2:16. This is what God did. The people are in terrible distress, and yet, even in the midst of their punishment, notice what God is doing, right? His punishment is faithfulness to His word, and even yet, His discipline is meant to be a means to what? What is God? Even the discipline, what is it meant to lead to in the people? Does that make sense? Repentance, right? This is even God's grace is evident in His judgment, right? That they're suffering at the hand of the ungodly peoples around them is meant to be a means that would lead them to repentance. That's his kindness even in the midst of this judgment. But here's the cycle he gives them. So 2:16. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. And yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. And they soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Even in that, isn't that kind of a rosy description of the previous generations, right? You see that? It says their fathers had obeyed the commands of the Lord. I mean, yeah, kind of, right? Which is pointing to God's grace in preserving them. Verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For, here's why God had done this. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. Where have we seen that language before? Exodus, right? Exodus 1 and 2, somewhere in chapters 1 and 2, right? Before the call of Moses. It's the same, right? God is responding the same to the people. He has not changed. He hears their groaning, even though here in Judges, it's more starkly as a result of their sin. He still is moved to pity by their groaning. Verse 19, but whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers. So here we're told that even after they repent from the time of the judges, their evil is even more pronounced. They go after other gods. They're serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. And so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left them when he died. So what's God saying here? He's saying, in a sense, I'm not going to fight for them anymore. He still is. I mean, he brings deliverance through the judges, but he is, in a sense, turning them over to the result of their disobedience. So Israel devolves into idolatry, disobedience, and God gives them over to that. Yeah, absolutely. God's faithfulness, and I think of places especially in the Psalms, right? When the psalmists are speaking about God and they talk about His steadfast love, right? This is it, right? It says the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, and this is what they're describing. They're looking back. The psalmists are looking back and saying God's covenantal love never ceases. His mercies are new and continuous. So what is we've already talked about this cycle of the judges, and we described it kind of as a downward spiral. But I do want you to see just progressively as we go through the cycles throughout the book, it really is the evil that replaces the revival after each judge, and even the characters of the judges themselves are in this downward slope. So again, we're not going to look at many of the specific judges, but I want you to have this in mind for your own study, right? So the cycle of the book, which repeats, the people are faithful for a time, then they give in to idolatry, they follow after the gods around them, God gives them over, they are oppressed, they're occupied. Something happens, the nations around them, the Philistines and other nations. And then they cry out to God, right? So they cry out for deliverance. And God sends a judge. And what does the judge do? He delivers them. He reminds them to be faithful to God. And for a period, they are obedient for a time. The land has rest. If you notice, that's a phrase that's used over and over again at the end of each of these stories of the judges. For example, after the judge Ehud, the second judge that's recorded for us, So chapter 3, verse 30, it says, "So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years." What's that describing? Flourishing under the covenant, right? This rest that we've talked about over and over again. This is what the people experience for a time, and then the cycle repeats itself, and yet the drop, the slope, whatever term you want to use, is more pronounced this next time, and this stair-stepping just continues, right? God sends a judge, faithfulness, and it's even further of a drop-off. This continues over and over again throughout the Judges, and then we're going to see when you get to chapter 17 through 21, this kind of last section of the book of Judges, there's no respite. There's no little, the cycle doesn't begin again. It just keeps going down much further off the board, and everything just falls apart, right? God doesn't send a judge in that period, and it's absolute chaos as a result of their idolatry in that last section. But who are some of these judges? Who are the judges that we see? The cycle is repeated. You'll get different numbers. Different people identify different judges. Were they a true judge or not? Who are a few of these? Well, if you just flip through the pages, you see them. So chapter 3, we have Othniel. He delivers the people of Israel there. So verses 7 through 11, Othniel. And then we have another judge, Ehud, at the end of chapter 3. His feats are described, the way that he rescues the people from their oppressors. And then Shamgar, poor Shamgar, he only gets one verse there at the end of 31. And yet we're told that he killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. But there, that's just cool. I've seen there's been short films that have been made just from that one verse. It's like, who is this Shamgar that? He doesn't get much press, but he did a great thing. So that's one of the judges. Then we have Deborah and Barak, perhaps there in chapter 4, perhaps one of the most well-known and one of the more righteous judges. We look to Deborah rightly in her acting as a judge, delivering the people in many ways, faithful to God. But still, we are on our way down this downward progression. Chapter 6 through 8, we have the story of Gideon. And again, Gideon in many ways is faithful to God, and yet he's even more conflicted, right, than the previous ones. He does some shady things, and especially towards the end of his life, as we see with many biblical characters, the wheels really fall off with Gideon as well. So we're continuing down this downward slope. We have Abimelech in chapter 9. Many people identify him as kind of an anti-judge. Right? He seems to try to assume a role of kingship, not just to be a judge, but to take this mantle of kingship over the peoples on himself, and yet he falls. We have Jephthah in chapter 10 through 12. That's outlined for us there, and his deliverance for the people, again, sketchy. And we see it continuing to progress downward. And then lastly, this final judge that we have for us is Samson. So that's in chapters 13 through 16. And then that concludes the time of the judges amongst the people. And chapter 17 through 21 is absolute chaos. But I do think it's interesting for us as we read the stories, and again, we're not going to spend time on each of them, but as you read these stories, as you think about how we've taught them in the past, and which is faithful, in many ways, especially with some of these, you come to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, and we're going to look at that, and it includes some of these judges. The writer of Hebrews says, he says, and we don't have time to recount the stories of Samson and Deborah and Barak, who in a sense said, and he says, who were faithful in their time. And yet you read Judges 13 through 16, and Samson, and he's an absolute disaster, right? I mean, he is. I've seen. Has anybody ever been to the what are they called? The Sight and Sound theaters? Have anybody seen those? Really? Well, then that's not helpful. They put on these big productions of biblical stories. There's one in Branson, Missouri, and there's one in Pennsylvania, I believe. And they're incredible. Like, the real animals, the camels walking down the aisles. If you've seen these, they're incredible. And I went to one here a couple years ago, and it was on Samson. And it was good. It was faithful to many parts of the storyline, and yet he's still portrayed almost entirely as a positive figure. And you read the specifics of his life, and it really is a disaster. And he finishes well. He is used to deliver the people there at the end of his life. But we're meant to see Samson as kind of at the bottom of this downward progression. He's sent by God. He does deliver the people. He's a means of God's grace. And yet his personal relationship, his personal fidelity to God is a disaster. It's all over the place. So what does that communicate to us? As we're looking at these judges, God sending them this downward progression, what does that tell us about God in the way that he uses these judges? Anyone? Okay, sure. It's an encouragement for us in many ways, right? That God uses imperfect people. Okay, certainly, that's there. What else?
It feels like there is this downward progression is almost like a not so subtle reminder of like, hey, you look at these guys, and it's still, even with these guys, like, they're never going to be able to give you true rest.
Mm-hmm.
They're never going to be able to actually, give you what you need.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every single passing one, you're like, oh, you're reminded that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. It should produce, again, that sense of longing in us, that God truly does send them as deliverers, and they serve that, and they do provide the people at least brief periods of respite and rest and rescue. And yet, it's like, maybe this guy's the one, right? This is the question over and over again. Maybe this guy's the one. Maybe he's going to lead the people into fullness of rest over and over and over again. And we're disappointed, and we have an increasing disappointment, and it should produce this longing in us. Okay, anything else? Mm-hmm.
He's the one that said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. But the people kept forsaking him.
Mm-hmm.
He never forsook them.
Yeah.
But he was a just God, too.
Yeah.
He told them what he's going to do, like you said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And he did it.
He did it.
You want blessings, you want curses.
Yeah. Yeah. He's faithful to his word every time. Yeah.
But also, you get ready to get into that about Eve.
Yeah.
Jumping ahead to the first Samuel, I just keep thinking about
Mm-hmm.
when they demanded king, and finally, God tells Samuel to anoint Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
God tells them, they did not reject you, but they rejected me.
Mm-hmm.
And even though God keeps people keep rejecting God, he keeps coming back. He still is patient. He still loves us. He's
Mm-hmm.
willing to forgive us. Every
Yeah.
good man, he talks about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
He still pursues us.
Absolutely. Right.
Of course,
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. And you think about previous books, kind of how in their drasticness they highlight for us the radical character of God, right? Leviticus, this radical holiness points to this really is how radical God's holiness is. Here in Judges, our radical sinfulness, and yet that highlights for us God's mercy and faithfulness. And yeah, that's good. Is that Adrian?
Reminds me of this weekend Southern posted that an essay from Andrew Fuller about what it looks like in the Christian life when we don't mourn our sin enough.
Mm.
And I think we see that pattern in Israel, and we can sort of translate a microcosm of that pattern into the Christian life of whenever we harbor this sin and we do not mourn it enough, even in those moments of repentance, the next time we come back to it, if it has not been truly mortified,
Mm-hmm.
then it takes an even harsher toll on ourselves, on our souls, and on our relationship with God.
Yeah, that's good. That's just like any other biblical book, right? I think we're meant, the sin that is exposed in Judges is meant to expose the sin in us personally. And if you haven't, place yourself in this story, right? Like Adrian's saying, if you see your own tendency, like the people, to experience the results of your sin, of my sin, and maybe a little bit of mourning, maybe a little bit of longing, and yet, however much time later, 40 years, 80 years, whatever it is, what do? Maybe there is some life in that sin, that I missed out on, right? And we go back, right? And this exposes our own hearts. That's good. Anything else? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's good. And when we read Judges in the storyline of the Bible so far, and in the storyline of what's coming, if you read and wrestle with and internalize what's taking place in Judges, when we remember what Moses had said and Joshua had said, here's God's way, follow him. And the people are like, absolutely, we're going to follow God. And Moses is like, you can't follow God. I mean, you're going to see this. You are not able to follow God because of your sin. You get to the prophets, same thing, right? It makes sense, right? We're able to experience this sense of longing and respond to it when the prophets say, return to God. And yet, you're not going to return to God because you need a new heart. You need God's Spirit within you to return to Him in obedience and faith. And that we're able to experience that in more fullness when we wrestle with a place like Judges, where we see this is what our sin is. This is what our sin does. That's good. So we're meant to read with increasing longing as we go through Judges, and in many ways, I would say, with less and less character celebration, right? This is what we often do. We read the book of Judges and we say, Samson was a pretty good guy. What can we learn from Samson? I mean, there's some things there, right? I mean, he's committed for his faith, and yet don't look at Samson, look to God. Look to the true deliverer. Okay, so that's the cycle of the Judges. And as we come to the last section of the book, again, we want to read it within the context here. The last section of the book is not just a collection of random stories. So this is chapters 17 through 21. It's not just random stories. It's not random experiences. In many ways, these chapters set up for what's coming in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and also, again, just describe the state of utter chaos when God's people forsake Him and are left to their own devices and their need for a deliverer, right? Their need for a faithful Savior. So this last section is really framed by these phrases that we said earlier of this notion of there was no king in Israel. And here's the references. These are the 4 times where it's stated there. Chapter 17, verse 6. This is the first that kind of marks out this last section of the book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then some of these progressive sections are introduced by a condensed version of that phrase. Chapter 18, verse 1, in those days there was no king in Israel. 19, verse 1, a new story, the most horrendous story. If you want to see the depravity of what's taking place in Israel, here it is. In those days there was no king from Israel. And then the very last statement of the book, summing it all up. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So let's look at some of these individual sections and just, I think, allow ourselves to be gripped with this is the result of idolatry and sin, right? This is what idolatry, in our own hearts, this is the kind of depravity that idolatry exposes and leads to. So let's walk through some of these sections here at the end of the book. So Samson dies in chapter 16. He's the last judge. He's a mess, and yet it gets worse. The downward spiral continues. It's chaos in Israel, and they are living completely according to their own desires and their urges. And what a challenge to us in our own time, where the narrative that we live by in our broader culture is do whatever you want to do, right? And this is what our desires and our wants lead to. This is what Judges is showing us. So in chapters 17 and 18, we have a picture of this idolatry, this stark idolatry playing out among a specific family in Israel and a pseudo-conquest, you could call it, here in 17 and 18. So look in chapter 17. We get this story of a specific man. Let's just read part of it. It says, there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah, and he said to his mother, the 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and also spoke it in my ears, behold, the silver is with me, I took it. Which seems just so random, right? We get this story of this son who's stealing from his mom. How much lower can you get, right? I mean, this is what we find. And his mother said, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." Okay, there's a little bit of hope. Maybe this mom is still faithful to Yahweh, to the God of Israel. It says, and he restored the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. And his mother said, "I dedicate the silver to the Lord." She uses his covenant name. "I dedicate the silver to Yahweh from my hand for my son to make a carved image and a metal image, and now therefore I will restore it to you." And so when he restored the money to his mother took 200 pieces of silver, gave it to the silversmith, who made it into a carved image and a metal image, and it was in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and a household gods, and ordained one of his sons who became his priest. And in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What's going on here? What's being described? It went sideways real quick, yeah. But what's happening? I mean, again, this seems like... Okay, sure. Yeah. Listen to the words she uses. "Blessed be my son by Yahweh. I dedicate the silver to Yahweh." She's using this worshipful language, and she says, "Oh, but to worship Yahweh, I'm going to make an image." Right? Okay. Yeah, right. I mean, breaking, and that's what the people, we read this, they're seeking to follow God, so they say, by breaking his commandments. How perverse and how ridiculous is that? But that's what we see play out. This here is good, and we're not going to have time to go into it. This should remind us of Exodus 32, and as the story progresses, we see that even in a more national sense, this is what this leads to. This is what takes place. Because we're going to see that, we won't have time to, but in 17 and 18, kind of the end of this story, what ends up happening is this image and this priest of this image that has an ephod, right? He's mimicking the worship of God for the sake of this idol. A group within Israel, a specific tribe, they take this priest, they take this image, they say, "Oh, we want to flourish, so we're going to take this priest and image for ourselves," and this guy becomes the priest of Dan, of a whole tribe of Israel. They say, hey. They try to hire him to be their tribal priest. They say, "Look, you're a priest for this one family, and that's fine. That's great. That's a good, job. But we want you to be the priest of our whole tribe." And so they take this guy to be with them. And again, we'll come to it later as we get into further books. But remember, he's established at Dan. And what happens at Dan? Anybody know? Later in the storyline of Israel and Judah? Yeah. So after the kingdom is divided, you have Israel in the north, and you have Judah in the south, and Jeroboam, the son of Solomon, he becomes the first king of the divided kingdom, or not the son of Solomon, but Jeroboam, after Solomon, becomes the king of this split-off northern tribe of Israel. And what does he say? He says, "My people are still going to try to go to Judah. They're still going to try to go to Jerusalem to worship. And if they do that, they might defect to my enemy, to the southern kingdom." And so he sets up 2 altars in northern Israel, literally two golden calves as places of worship, so that the people will no longer go to Jerusalem to worship, and they'll stay in the northern kingdom. And this is one of those places that's set up. Dan and is it Bethel are the 2 places that are established. And so, literally, this golden calf from Exodus 32 becomes the national policy of the northern kingdom of Israel later. We see this degeneration, and we're getting an explanation here of where that comes from in 17 and 18. So this idolatry here, author of Judges is telling us, idolatry leads to further and more depraved idolatry. It doesn't give life like it promises. This is the challenge for us. It doesn't give life. It doesn't give flourishing. It only leads to further depravity and death, even though it promises life. So we see that play out in this. I tried to describe the whole section. I said a thieving son, an idol dedicated to Yahweh, and a fake priest. That's what we see here in chapter 17 and in chapter 18. as well. Okay, let's look at 19, and then so 17 and 18 kind of go together, and then really I think 19 through 21 kind of go together to describe what's taking place here amongst the people. So here we have what we could call heinous crimes among Benjamin. We don't have time to read through it. I encourage you, unless you have a light stomach, to read through Judges chapter 19. And what do we see take place here in Judges 19? Well, it's intrigued by the statement, there was no king in Israel, and we're told of a certain Levite. So this man who is meant to be among those who lead worship among the people of God, we're told he has a concubine. He goes to a nearby city, he goes to a nearby place, and he spends the night in this city with a man, finds him and his concubine in the town square and says, no, come and stay with me tonight. And we're told that the men of the city come to this man's house and want to abuse and rape this man. And he goes out and says, no, don't do that. Here's my daughter. Here's this man's concubine. Do what you will. Leave this man alone. And that's what happens. And this young lady is brutally mistreated. She's murdered. And this Levite, after this takes place, he takes her dead body, takes her home, and we're told at the end of 19 that he cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends those pieces to the tribes of Israel, and is calling out sin, right? He says, look what's happened. Look what these people have done in the land of Benjamin. And then civil war takes place as a result of that. Just a few things that I want us to see here, just big picture. If you read through 19, why does Judges 19 sound familiar? Just in that brief overarching storyline of what takes place. Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So Judges 19, and you go back and read Genesis, is it 19 as well? Yeah, Genesis 19. The story of Lot, right? The three men, the three angels, the three individuals that come to Abraham, say, hey, we're going to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah and see if the wickedness is as bad as has come before God's ears. And they go, and they're staying in the town square. And Lot says, no, come and stay with me. And this exact storyline takes place. So what do we see here? In their idolatry, in their sin, Israel has become like Sodom and Gomorrah. And that phrase is repeated in the prophets, right? All throughout the rest of the Old Testament. The prophets, the psalmists, they use this language of Israel having become like Sodom and Gomorrah. And then in chapter 20, after this civil war takes place as a result of this, we see where there's war against all the other tribes of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin, where this horrendous crime took place. And as you go back and read later, I want you to notice there in chapter 20, we see as this city in Benjamin is destroyed, that it very much patterns after what the people of Israel do at the city of Ai in Joshua chapter 8, where the people of Israel among Benjamin themselves are put under the ban and are meant to be destroyed like the people of Ai in Joshua chapter 8. So you see what's happening here? God is showing in their idolatry, Israel has become so much like the nations that they are deserving of his judgment as Sodom and Gomorrah, and that they themselves should be put under the ban, should be wiped out so that no one breathes. And this isn't foreign nations. This is happening within the land of Israel. And this is the result of their idolatry. We're gonna stop there. 21 builds up on this story. It's so depraved that it's comical in the best sense of the word, right? That these people come together and they destroy this the people of Benjamin. They wipe out all but a few hundred Benjamites. They destroy women, children, wipe out the city, and then they say, "Oh, but we can't let one of the tribes of God of Israel be completely destroyed. There's only these men left, and they need wives so that they can have children and extend their line. And we have said that we will not marry among them because they have committed this heinous crime in Israel. And so they go and multiple times they steal wives for these Benjamites so that they might be able to extend their families and their lines. I encourage you to read that more specifically, but here's what I think we need to notice. On this theme, and here in Judges chapter 21, the people of Israel are faithful to their own vows to the T, not to intermarry with the remaining men from the tribe of Benjamin because of the crime that they have committed as outlined in chapter 19. And yet, what has been taking place the whole time throughout the book of Joshua and Judges since they came into the land? Breaking their vow to the Lord not to do what? Not to intermarry, because God says, do not intermarry with the nations in the land, not just because it's not an ethnic statement, it's because they will lead you astray and lead you to the worship of foreign gods. All right, so we have this inverse of the promises of God playing out, that they are completely unfaithful to God's commands not to intermarry with these foreign nations, and yet they keep their own vow not to intermarry with those among Israel who have committed this heinous crime. And so they... Mm-hmm.
And cherry picking what they want,
Mm-hmm.
throwing out what they do not want.
Yeah.
If we can't draw conclusions to that for our own selves and our own situation,
Mm-hmm.
we need help.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And this, I think, is a good principle for us to notice in our own lives and that God shows to us here. Well, this is what we see in the New Testament, right? What is sin? Satan comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And sin becomes, often in our own lives, an inversion of God's way of flourishing in life, right? Taking a little nugget of truth and leading to absolute destruction because we are seeking it apart from God, right? And that's what we see here play out in Judges. It's a complete inversion of God's covenant blessings and promises. Yeah. So we see God's, yeah. Sure. Some faithfulness, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's good. Yeah, so there's God's faithfulness within that, and we see that even in more immediate context here. Just storyline wise, and this is really making me question why. It's like, oh, this is a nice name. My parents thought these guys did some horrible stuff. Like, well, thanks, Mom and Dad. Why, even in the more immediate storyline, where does Benjamin come out in the story of the monarchy that proceeds right after this? That's where Saul comes from, right? They say, give us a king like the nations. And they get exactly what they ask for. And conversely, if you read throughout Judges, Judah is portrayed in a little bit more of a positive light. And why is that? In the story of the monarchy. So the kingly line comes most immediately, leads us to David, right? All of this is being laid out for us. Okay, it's time for us to wrap up. So I know this week, I think, is for me, has felt a lot more disjointed and trying to summarize some of these things. But I want us to look at the last few verses of Judges to conclude. So this story, we'll begin in verse 23 of chapter 21. And the people of Benjamin did so, and they took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. So they've stolen wives for themselves from within Israel. They go to Shiloh, and they steal wives for themselves. And they went, and they returned to their inheritance, and they rebuilt the towns and lived in them. Verse 24, and the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and his family, and they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. Where does that language come from? Or does that sound familiar? This is just like the end of Joshua, right? The people go out to their inheritance, right? And yet, different ending than Joshua. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every One did what was right in his own eyes. So you read through this in the centuries following when this would have been available, but also for us today, what is meant to be the feeling that you have at the end of the book of Judges? What is it meant to produce in you? Yeah. Yeah. I think about this biblical refrain. How long, O Lord? When is the king going to come? Right? When is a deliverer going to come?
And at the same time, they had a king.
And at the same time, they already have a king.
The king that
Yeah.
they're looking for, kings that they look for to come at them
Mm-hmm.
are they continue to spiral really.
Absolutely.
How long until you start doing what I tell you to do?
Mm-hmm.
And then the martyrs in Revelation under the golden altar, that's what they say.
Yeah.
That phrase comes up
Mm-hmm.
again.
Absolutely.
They ask Jesus, how long?
Yeah.
Woe, or
Absolutely.
your judgment.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
you keep seeing that phrase.
There's this sense of longing, right? Sense of expectation. And this is it. The people, there indeed was no king in Israel. And that's a true statement. God had not ceased to be king, but the people did not acknowledge him as their king. And so, it seems like we come into Ruth. This is kind of an aside, as we're going to look at next week. Ruth takes place within the time of the judges, we're told in Ruth 1:1. But in the Hebrew ordering of books, it progresses directly into 1st and 2nd Samuel, this story of what king is going to come. And so we end this book with this expectation, with this longing, with this hope that there is going to be a deliverer, right? That's where it tracks in this storyline of redemption. We see God's little glimmers of God's mercy and grace all throughout the book, that he responds, that he delights to send a deliverer to rescue his people, even as they are disobeying him and forsaking him. And I think along with that longing, this longing for a deliverer, we are meant to have, that longing is only meant to be increased by our own bearing of the weight of our sin, right? That's what Judges leaves you with. It leaves you with this weight of our own sin, of idolatry, that we see that idolatry is a snare, just as God says it would be to the people, that they become like the gods they worship, and that idolatry brings death and injustice. And yet, conversely, the promise of the gospel, the hope of life, is that if we look to and behold God in the face of Jesus Christ, we find life and flourishing and all of the fulfillment of what we see in Judges finds its place in the flourishing and life that Jesus offers as the true King, who does indeed bring deliverance to us, to his people. All right, thank you all. There's some things on the back of your sheet for next time. I encourage you to do in preparation for us looking at Ruth next week, and looking forward to doing that with you. Let me just briefly pray, and we'll be done. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the weightiness of it, and that you expose our own hearts that we so often fail to see, and that you also reveal yourself to be the fulfillment of the longing that we have. So thank you for this time together just to look at your word, and disjointed as it may be, to see the fullness in your word, as our inability to see it clearly. I thank you for the time to encourage each other in that longing for you. Help us now as we go into worship, and transform us by your word. In Jesus' name, amen.